All right. So, I don't know if you guys know this or not, but the first person, I don't know what's going on. I was just going to ignore it and move on. But yeah, there's a party down there, apparently. But anyway, so the first person to ever try to climb Mount Everest, his name was George Mallory. And I don't personally know him. In fact, he died in one of his attempts to climb Mount Everest, and so I never had the chance of meeting him. But I would imagine that he was kind of like a pretty rough it kind of guy. If if his main goal in life was to be the first person to climb Mount Everest, he'd probably be a pretty interesting character. But I was doing some research about him this week, and I found just this amazing quote by him that I wanted to just start this service with this morning. And so he was doing an interview with some reporters, I guess, and they were asking him, why would you even want to try this? Why would you want to risk your life, eventually give up your life for this goal of climbing a mountain? Is it really worth it? Is it of any use at all? And I love what he responded. And this is a really long quote. We've edited it for time, but he essentially said this: "It is no use. There is not the slightest prospect of any gain whatsoever. We shall not bring back a single bit of gold or silver, not a gem, nor any coal or iron. We shall not find a single foot of earth that can be planted with crops to raise food. It is no use. What we get from this adventure is just sheer joy." And then he goes on to talk about how, life isn't about just working, going from one thing to the next, but it's about how we work so that we can find joy, right? And so he kind of flips that on its head of we've got to work and then maybe squeeze in some fun things every now and then. But he flips it and he says, no, we do the work so that we can fund the fun things, essentially. And I just love that idea that he was doing this thing for no reason other than just sheer joy. And maybe you have a hobby like that. Maybe there's something that you just enjoy doing just for the sake of doing it, whatever it is. I don't know if it's fishing or hunting or watching a football game or, something that just makes you happy. Whatever that thing may be. If we were really to sit down and ask ourselves, am I really getting anything from this? Maybe with some of our hobbies, if you're a fisher or a hunter, yeah, I guess you get a fish or an animal at the end of the day, but it'd be a lot easier to just go buy that from the store, and it'd probably be cheaper in the long run if you just went and bought it from the store. So let's not kid ourselves by saying, maybe there was a time when it was necessary to do that kind of stuff, but we do these things all the time that simply make us happy. And yet when we come to church, we have this expectation that we're going to get something from it. That there's going to be some kind of reward for coming. God's going to bless me, or I'm going to, whatever it may be. That I'm going to feel just filled with the Holy Spirit. I'm going to really meet with God this morning. Right? So in life, we do these things that we're not really expecting to gain anything from. And then we come to church with this expectation of getting something. And if you've been with us for the past couple of weeks, you know that we're in this series that's called Wasted in Worship, which is kind of a weird sermon title. I get that. But the reality is that the bottom line of this sermon series is that worship is not about us. And in fact, sometimes it may feel like we're wasting things in worship. We're wasting our time and our resources. But it's exactly what God has called us to do. And if you weren't here last week, just to review, our bottom line from last week was that worship, especially corporate worship, when we all gather together like this, is so important because it's practice for what we do for eternity. And we talked about how practice is important because the more you do it, the better you get at it. And so it's important to gather together. But it's as equally as important to worship in our everyday lives. And so the sermon title this morning is simply called Worship as You Work. But it's so much more than that. It's worship as you work, worship as you eat, worship as you hang out with people, worship in every aspect of your lives. Because it's so much more than just this hour that we see each other every week. Now don't get me wrong, this is important. And if you forgot how important this time is, I want to encourage you to go back and listen to that message. Because it's kind of a both and thing, right? We need corporate worship, but then we also need worship in every area of our lives. And in Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, this is a pretty famous verse, so you may have heard it before, but Paul reminds us just what that kind of worship can look like. So in Romans 12, he says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And this beautiful promise, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So we're going to camp out in those two verses this morning. We're just going to break it down because there's so much. And I think it's so important that Paul starts these verses by saying, in view of God's mercy. And if you're not really a biblical scholar, don't worry, I'm not either, but what biblical scholars have kind of said is that Romans is broken into these different parts. And so up until this point, Paul has been breaking down, what God's mercy looks like. And then here we're kind of at a turning point where he's just breaking down, kind of the abstract, the not really practical, just like out there theology about God's mercy. In general, this is what God's mercy looks like. And then here we're kind of taking a turning point, and the rest of Romans is going to be about practical ways that you and I can live out the reality that we've been saved. But I don't think it's any coincidence that Paul takes 11 chapters to explain God's mercy. And then in one verse, he puts mercy and worship together. Because we can't worship without understanding God's mercy. I think in your bulletin it says worship starts with an understanding of God's mercy. That's where it has to start. Because we can't worship something if we don't understand just how much we need it. And so, if you're here this morning and you're not really sure, if God's mercy applies to you, I just want to encourage you to say, yes, it does. God's mercy extends to you. No matter where you're at, no matter what you've done, you are eligible for God's mercy. All you have to do is admit that you need it. And then, once you admit that you need it, and after God has given it to you, and as long as you've believed it, then you've received that mercy. But you have to admit it, because you can't, you can't take mercy for something if you don't believe that you need it, if you don't believe that you deserve justice instead. And by justice, I mean simply that we are all sinners. And that justice for each one of us would be something that we don't want. But yet God has given us mercy. And so in order to really be able to worship God in every area of our lives, we have to understand what we've been saved from. And then, out of that thanksgiving of, what we've been saved from, and after a proper understanding of what God has done for us, then we can worship. And worship simply looks like offering our bodies as a living sacrifice, right? And Paul says it right there. Worship is to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. And this is your true and proper worship. And so then, once we understand that God's mercy applies to each one of us, and once we understand just what God has done to free us from what we should deserve, and once we understand all of that, then we can offer our bodies as a living sacrifice, and it will be holy and pleasing to God. And there are so many ways that we could live that would be pleasing to ourselves or to the world, but true worship strives to please Him. And living your life in a way that is salt and light to a dark and broken world, that's true worship. That's worship that comes out of an understanding of God's mercy. And it's to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice, just like Paul said, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice that is holy and pleasing to God. In fact, the sacrifice that Paul is referencing is most likely the burnt offering sacrifice in the Old Testament. And in case you don't have the entire book of Leviticus memorized, I'm just going to give you a quick refresher of what the burnt offering sacrifice looked like. These ones, the burnt offerings, they were the offerings that were brought to the Lord, just because. Like, there were different types of offerings. There was a sin offering that you could bring to the Lord if you had accidentally sinned and you wanted to make retribution. And then there was the tithe, that was kind of an obligatory thing. But these burnt offerings were brought, just because you wanted to, just because you wanted to show God how much you love Him. And this was the way to do it back then. And then what also kind of sets the burnt offering apart from all these other offerings in the Old Testament is that the burnt offering was burnt beyond use. It was totally consumed by fire. And that's different than the other offerings because most of the other offerings that were brought, at least a portion, if not the entire sacrifice, was, it was put on the altar and then it was taken back to feed the Levites and the priests and those working in the temple. But the burnt offering was special because it was completely consumed by fire. In other words, it was completely given to God. There was no practical gain from it. Like a lot of the things in the Old Testament were set up so that the Levites and the priests, they could still make a living so that they could dedicate their whole lives to serving God. And they didn't have to worry about farming and having another job or anything like that. And so a lot of the sacrifices were pretty practical. There was this practical element to it because God is a practical God. But this one element, the burnt offering that Paul is most likely referring to here, it was burnt completely beyond use. And so I don't know about you, but to me that kind of feels like a waste. Why kill an animal just to burn it? I understand, I'm not a vegetarian. I understand killing animals to eat them or to, get something from them, but why just to burn it completely? And I think the reason that God set up this offering was, for one, it shows God that the person who is bringing the offering trusts him completely. Because back in the days of these sacrifices, people would often measure their wealth by how big their flocks were, how many animals they had. And that honestly sounds like a better system than just paper money. But that's how they would measure their wealth. And so it would essentially be the equivalent of us bringing $500 and just lighting it on fire. That's essentially what people were doing. But what it shows God is that you trust him completely. And even when you waste your resources in worship, you're trusting that God will take care of you. And so kind of the equivalent today, because most of us, don't have spare cows laying around that we're just going to go set on fire. So kind of the equivalent is to offer ourselves as a living sacrifice, to bring ourselves to the altar and say, God, I don't care what you do with me, but here I am. I want to live my life for you. I want to give my career to you. I want to give my family to you, my marriage to you. And do with it whatever you want, right? Because it's a burnt offering. I'm not touching it anymore. It's yours. So it's kind of the equivalent to the burnt offering. And I think it's so vital that he says that we need to offer our bodies. Because that includes everything that we do, right? Not just our minds, not just what we think, but what actually comes out of our mouths, what we actually do with our hands. What we do when we're all alone, what we do when we're with a group of people. Everything that we do can be an act of worship. All right, so that's kind of what God is calling us to. That's the level of commitment that he's calling us to. And I love it when people say, oh, I'm a New Testament Christian. I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but I've heard people reference, I don't really believe in the God of the Old Testament, I'm a New Testament Christian. And so basically what they're saying with that is, I don't have to follow the rules because I have freedom in Christ. And yes, that's true. But that's not the whole story. Because yes, we don't have this old sacrificial system. But what God calls us to is so much deeper than that. Right? Because in the Old Testament, they could offer this sacrifice once and it would be over. But in the New Testament, God asks us to offer this sacrifice every single day, every single minute. Right? And you'll find that all throughout Scripture. That something that was done in the Old Testament could be just a one and done thing. But then in the New Testament, Jesus kind of flips it and he says, I want you to do this and then some. Right? I want you to actually live out the heart behind the law, not just the letter of the law. And so that's kind of what God is calling us to. Right? And so it's actually more difficult to be a New Testament Christian, if you will. Because God calls us to not just change our outward actions, but our heart. And that's what worship looks like. And then Paul goes on and he says, do not conform to the pattern of this world. Right? And that's kind of why he says that, because the world tells us to just look out for number one, right? They say, oh, just follow your heart. Do what your heart is telling you. Put on your own oxygen mask before helping people around you, right? Look out for number one. And that's the pattern of this world. But we are not to conform to this world. So if the world tells us to look out for number one, to look after myself first, then not conforming to the world would look like putting others before ourselves. Helping others, even if it means that we get hurt. That's what not conforming looks like. Right? If we want to be different from the world, we have to put God first through the way that we love others. It means that we have to look different than this world. Right? It means that we don't get to carry the same worries and burdens that this world carries. Right? Because this world loves to get caught up in all of these different worries and burdens and fears and anxieties. But as Christians, we don't get to carry those burdens because we know that Christ has taken them away. So we don't get to pick them back up. And it means to not conform to this world. It means that when your kids are getting on your last nerve, or your spouse or your coworker is on your last nerve, and you just want to snap and just yell at them, it means that instead we have to take a step back and take a deep breath and think about how God in His grace would handle the situation. Right? It means we have to look different than the world. It means that when someone posts on Facebook something that you know is wrong, and you just want to type away this long sermon about why it's wrong, instead of doing that, we have to respond in love, or maybe not respond at all for some of us. It means, not getting caught up in this world means that we don't conform to a political party, because we know that in the end, we are citizens of heaven who happen to live in America. That's what not conforming to this world looks like. Now, don't get me wrong, I do believe that we should be political as Christians. But our priority and our first love is not a political party, but it is our heavenly citizenship. All right, and so everything that we do can be an act of worship. Everything that we do. But it has to happen in view of God's mercy. It has to happen in view of God's mercy. And that's why Paul starts it by saying, in view of God's mercy. Because if we just start trying to change ourselves, if we just start trying to, give ourselves as an offering of worship, without first understanding what God has done for us, then it just becomes works righteousness. It just becomes us trying to earn our salvation. And yet, there's nothing that we can do to earn our salvation. And so instead of trying to earn it, we have to keep God's mercy at the forefront of our minds. And then all of these actions that I've been talking about flow through out of a transformed and a renewed mind. Right? Because that's Paul's next point, is that we have to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And so as we begin to fill ourselves with Christ-like things, as we begin to offer ourselves, as we realize that God's mercy is what should fuel our actions, our minds will become renewed. As Christ becomes more and more present in our lives, our minds will be renewed and transformed. Right? And I love digging into what different words in the Greek mean. I'm kind of a nerd if you haven't picked up on that already, especially when it comes to the Bible. I just love dissecting the Bible. And so I love, figuring out what the Greek was, or what was the author really saying with this word. And so this week when I was researching, I looked into the Greek word for renewed. And you know what I found? Renewed, the Greek word simply means to make new. Wouldn't you know it, that the word renew simply means to make new. And it's simply because offering ourselves as a living sacrifice renews us. It makes us a new person. And that's why, we often say in Christianese, I've been born again. Because we've literally been renewed. We've been transformed into a completely different person, right? The old has gone, the new has come. And so offering ourselves as a living sacrifice renews us and transforms us into the person that we were meant to be. If you've ever wondered, like, who am I? What is my purpose here on earth? Let me tell you that the first step to figuring that out is to offering yourself as a living sacrifice. And why do we need to be renewed? The answer is simply that our joy has been stolen from us. Right? This world steals our joy. And the antidote is worship. And if you don't believe me, just think about this. When you were a kid, how excited did you get for Christmas? I mean, I don't know about you, but I would always have trouble sleeping on Christmas Eve because when I was really little, I'd be listening for Santa's footsteps, and I would just be so excited, like, what am I going to get for Christmas this year? I'd be so excited that I just couldn't sleep, and it's the one time a year I'm a morning person. Nowadays, I don't really get that excited for Christmas anymore. I mean, maybe I'm just a Grinch, and I probably am. But to me, the whole Christmas season is just kind of stressful. Like, I love fall, but I don't really love the stress leading up to Christmas. I'm just being honest with you. And maybe that's just me. But the reality is, there's so many things that get added to an already full plate, and so many extra things to buy in a budget that already seems stretched too far. And so it just adds stress to me. And this is supposed to be a time that's filled with wonder and joy. And as a pastor, it should probably be my favorite time of the year. But the reality is, this world is really good at stealing our joy. And the longer we're in it, the more that happens. Right? Because we have an enemy who wants to hurt us. Because he knows that there's nothing he can do to hurt God. He knows that God's already won. But if he can't hurt God, the next best thing he can do is hurt the people he loves the most. And that's you and me. And so we have this enemy that's constantly trying to attack us, right? And he invents things like chaos. And he invents things like late night at the office and hunger and war and all of these different things that just steal our joy. But the antidote to all of that is worship. Everyday worship. Right? Because we can live joyously again. Because we have hope in Christ, and that hope leads us to worship. And then we'll be able to answer that all-consuming question of who am I and what am I here for? All right, because Paul goes on and he says that then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, perfect, and pleasing will. So if you've ever wondered, I'm not really sure if this is God's will for my life. I don't really know what God would have me do. I can promise you that as long as you are putting yourself on the altar, as long as you're offering yourself every day in worship, then God's will become clearer and clearer to you. So maybe there's an area in your life that you haven't fully given up to God. Maybe you're good at worshiping God, except for this one thing, that kind of gets in your way, like a pebble in your shoe, that just kind of ruins your day a little bit. Maybe for you, that thing is a sin that you're hoping never comes to light. Because if it did, then your whole world would implode. And it just nags at you at the back of your head. Or maybe there's an unforgiveness that you're holding on to because you believe that the person that hurt you deserves to be punished. But let me tell you, it's not yours to avenge. God will deal with that person in whatever way he sees best. But your job is to forgive them. Right? And maybe there's something that you've been feeling in the back of your mind that God is asking you to do, or maybe asking you to stop doing something, and you're just not willing to because you're afraid of what that next step might look like for you. Right? And so all of these different things, and there's so many more, they can get in our way. They can be that pebble in the shoe that can get in our way between us and our worship. They can get in the way between us and our joy. And so maybe for you, the first step to offering yourself as a living sacrifice is to simply examine your life and to see if there's anything that God may be asking you to give up. Whatever you came in carrying this morning, whatever burden makes it difficult for you to get out of bed in the morning, or makes it difficult for you to smile, whatever that burden is, it's keeping you from joy. And so the question simply remains, is that thing, whatever that thing is it worth more than your joy? And I can assure you that the answer is always no. And so as we put that thing down, whatever it is, whatever burden we're carrying, if we give it to God in trust that He'll take care of it, that can be our worship. And that can help us to learn how to worship Him. And as we learn to worship Him, then we'll find our purpose, and with that purpose will come joy. So I just want to ask you this morning, is it worth it? Is your burden worth the cost of a joyless life? Let's go to the Lord in prayer this morning. Father God, we know that your Bible tells us to worship you, but we admit that sometimes it's really hard. And sometimes our careers get in the way, or our fear gets in the way, or all of these different things that we hold on to can get in the way of us worshiping you. But God, as we learned this morning, we were put on this earth to worship you. We were put on this earth to offer ourselves as living sacrifices. And anything that comes in the way of that is just going to steal our joy. And so God, whatever that is this morning, we just lay it before you. God, whether that's unforgiveness that we've been harboring, that's making us bitter, that's giving us a pit in our stomach every time we think about that person, God, we lay that at your feet. Or God, whether it's fear about tomorrow, fear about how the bills are going to get paid, or how we're going to deal with that coworker at work, or how we're going to give our family the bad news. God, whatever that fear is, it's keeping us from joy. So God, we lay that down too. And God, maybe our thief looks more mundane, right? Maybe instead of big news, it's just that we've gotten caught up in the day-to-day life and we've forgotten our purpose. And so God, if that's us, then we just lay that before you. And we admit that we've gotten caught up in the day-to-day and we've forgotten what it looks like to really worship you. And so God, we lay ourselves at your altar. We offer ourselves as living sacrifices so that we can wake up tomorrow and the next day and the next day just knowing that you have saved us, that we exist because of your mercy, and you love us, and you are worthy to be worshipped. And so everything we do, we want to be an act of worship. So Father, we love you. We thank you for the gift of mercy, how it can change our lives, how it can give us joy again, even in a world that tries so desperately to steal it. God, we thank you that you can give us joy as we worship you. Lord, it's in your holy and precious name that we pray.